The blood-red sun hung low in the Arizona sky as Gwendolyn Caldwell watched in silent horror as her uncle tossed back another whiskey. With each empty glass, the leering glances from the men gathered in the crowded saloon grew more predatory, and her future dimmed a shade darker. It was 1885, and at 20 years old, Gwen had become nothing more than merchandise in her uncle's twisted scheme to settle his gambling debts. "Gentlemen," Uncle Silas's voice boomed across the Golden Spur saloon, "today is your lucky day. My lovely niece here comes with a handsome dowry, her mother's gold and her father's land deed. Prime property, gentlemen. All you need is to outbid these fine fellows." Gwen's cheeks burned with humiliation. 3 months ago, she'd been the beloved daughter of prosperous ranchers, preparing to attend a ladies' college back east. Now, orphaned after the fever took both her parents within days of each other, she'd been forced under the guardianship of her father's only brother, a man who'd appeared at the funeral with false sympathy and real greed. The saloon was filled with the worst sort of men, prospectors with gold fever in their eyes, ranch hands looking to claim both a wife and property in one stroke, and aging widowers whose gazes lingered too long on her youth. Gwen clutched her mother's locket, its thin gold chain the only piece of jewelry Uncle Silas had allowed her to keep. "We'll start the bidding at $500, Silas announced, slapping a weathered document on the table, her father's land deed. Beside it, he placed her mother's jewelry box, which she knew contained the family gold coins saved over generations. A flurry of voices called out bids, each one making Gwen's stomach twist tighter. 500, 600, 800. The numbers climbed as men evaluated her worth against the land and gold being offered. Not one of them looked at her as a person, just a bonus that came with the property. 900 and my prized stallion, called a graying rancher with yellowed teeth. 1,000 and my claim at Whispering Creek, countered a bearded miner. The saloon door swung open, letting in a shaft of dying sunlight that momentarily blinded everyone inside. When Gwen's eyes adjusted, she saw a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway, dust from the trail still settling around his boots. As he stepped into the light, the room quieted. He was younger than most, perhaps 25, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the color of a summer storm. He moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable with both his gun and his place in the world. "What's all this commotion about?" he asked, his deep voice carrying across the suddenly hushed room. Uncle Silas's smile widened. Another bidder meant more money. "Auction, sir. For this fine young lady's hand and her considerable dowry." The stranger's eyes found Gwen's, and unlike the others, his gaze held compassion. He studied her face, noting her clenched jaw and the defiant tilt of her chin, though she couldn't hide the fear in her eyes. "Name's Clayton Dawson," he said, removing his hat and nodding respectfully to Gwen before turning back to Silas. "And I don't recall marriage auctions being legal in this territory." Silas's face darkened. "I'm her guardian. It's my right to arrange a suitable match. 1,500. Called out a voice from the back, eager to resume the bidding. The stranger Clayton stepped forward, his spurs jingling softly against the wooden floor. He approached the table where Gwen stood trapped beside her uncle, and in one swift motion, he swept the deed and jewelry box off the surface and handed them to her. "These belong to the lady," he said simply. Before Silas could protest, Clayton reached for Gwen's hand. His touch was gentle but firm as his eyes asked a silent question. Understanding flooded through her, and she gave him the smallest of nods. Clayton turned to face the room, still holding her hand. "This auction is over, gentlemen. Now see here." Silas growled, reaching for his hip where Gwen knew he kept a small pistol. Clayton didn't flinch. "The lady is leaving with me. She's my dowry enough." The room erupted in protests and confusion. Clayton pulled Gwen closer to his side, shielding her with his body as he backed them toward the door. "You can't just take her," Silas shouted, his face purple with rage. "She's worth a fortune." "She's worth far more than you'll ever understand," Clayton replied evenly. "And she's not for sale." A burly man stepped into their path. "I was winning that auction, Cowboy." Clayton's hand hovered near his holster. "There is no auction, just a lady who needs escorting home." "She ain't got a home," Silas sneered. "Her parents are dead and I'm selling what's left." The saloon had grown dangerously quiet. Gwen could feel the tension building like a thunderstorm. Whatever this stranger's intentions, he'd put himself in grave danger for her sake. She couldn't let him face this alone. "My home," Gwen spoke for the first time, her voice stronger than she expected, "is the Double C Ranch. My parents left it to me, not to my uncle. He has no right to sell anything that belongs to me." Several men shifted uncomfortably. Auctions for brides weren't unheard of in these parts, but stealing a woman's inheritance was another matter. "Is that true?" the bartender asked, wiping a glass slowly. "Caldwell's place belongs to the girl." "Damned right it does," came a new voice from the doorway. Sheriff Thomas Riley stepped into the saloon, his badge catching the lamplight. "I witnessed James Caldwell's will myself before he passed. Everything goes to his daughter when she turns 21, with provisions for her care until then." Silas's face drained of color. "She needs a husband to manage the property. I'm only doing what's best. Looks to me like she's found someone willing to help her with that," the sheriff interrupted, nodding toward Clayton. "That right, Dawson?" Clayton's eyes met Gwen's again, and this time she saw something more than compassion, a promise. "If the lady wishes it," he said softly. Gwen studied his face, searching for deceit but finding none. This man had stepped into danger for a stranger. He'd handed her back her parents' legacy without hesitation. In a world where every man she'd encountered since her parents' death had tried to take something from her, Clayton Dawson had only given. "I wish it," she replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. The sheriff nodded. "Then I suggest you two come down to my office and we sort this out proper. As for you, Silas, I think we need to discuss a few matters regarding guardianship and attempted theft." As Silas spluttered protests, Clayton guided Gwen toward the door, his hand still holding hers as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "Thank you," she whispered as they stepped out into the evening air. Clayton looked down at her, his expression serious. "Don't thank me yet, Miss Caldwell. I made quite a declaration in there, but I want you to know that I expect nothing from you. I couldn't stand by and watch what was happening, that's all." "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the sounds of the town. "Why help a stranger?" Clayton's eyes softened. "My mother was sold off by her brother after my grandparents died. The man who bought her was cruel. I promised myself I'd never stand by if I saw it happening to someone else." For the first time in months, hope flickered in Gwen's heart. "What happens now?" "Now," he said with a gentle smile, "we talk to the sheriff and make sure your inheritance is protected. After that, well, that's entirely up to you." As they walked toward the sheriff's office, Gwen realized she was still clutching her mother's jewelry box and her father's deed in one hand, while her other remained in Clayton's steady grip. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she didn't feel alone. 2 hours later, Gwen sat in Sheriff Riley's office, the legal papers spread across his desk. Clayton stood by the window, giving her space while remaining protectively nearby. The sheriff had summoned Judge Wilson, who'd arrived promptly, still wearing his dinner napkin. "It's clear as day," the judge declared, adjusting his spectacles. "James and Alina Caldwell left everything to their daughter, Gwendolyn. Silas Caldwell was named temporary guardian until her 21st birthday, with the explicit instruction that he was to provide for her education and welfare using a specific monthly allowance from the estate, which he clearly hasn't done." the sheriff added. Instead, he's been trying to sell off her dowry and marry her off to the highest bidder. Judge Wilson nodded gravely. A serious breach of trust. I'm removing him as guardian effective immediately. Relief washed over Gwen, but uncertainty quickly followed. What happens to me now? I'm not 21 for another 9 months. The judge and sheriff exchanged glances. Normally, we'd appoint another guardian, the judge said, but given the circumstances, she could stay at the widow Parker's boarding house, Sheriff Riley suggested. Respectable place for a young lady. Gwen's heart sank. After everything that had happened, the thought of being alone among strangers was almost unbearable. Clayton cleared his throat. If I may, Your Honor, Miss Caldwell and I have discussed a possible arrangement. The judge raised an eyebrow. Go on. A marriage of convenience, Clayton said. Miss Caldwell would have the protection of my name, and I would help manage her property until she comes of age, at which point everything would revert fully to her control. Gwen watched the men's faces, her pulse quickening. This hadn't been what Clayton had suggested when they'd spoken privately before the judge arrived. He'd merely offered to escort her to her ranch and help her find suitable protection there. Is this what you want, Miss Caldwell? The judge asked, his eyes kind but searching. Gwen looked at Clayton, who gave her a slight nod of reassurance. Mr. Dawson is offering me a way to return to my home and protect my inheritance, she said carefully. I would be grateful for such an arrangement. And after she turns 21, Sheriff Riley asked. Clayton's gaze never left Gwen's face. Then Miss Caldwell is free to make whatever choice brings her happiness. If she wishes to end our arrangement, I'll step aside with no claim on her or her property. The judge studied them both for a long moment before sighing. It's unorthodox, but given the circumstances, it may be the best solution. I'll draw up the papers with those specific conditions. He turned to Clayton. You understand, Mr. Dawson, that this arrangement gives you no legal right to sell or transfer any of Miss Caldwell's property. That's exactly as it should be, Your Honor, Clayton replied. Very well, the judge said. Sheriff, would you fetch Reverend Michaels? I believe we have a wedding to perform. As the sheriff left, Gwen found herself alone with Clayton and the judge, who busied himself with paperwork. Clayton moved closer, kneeling beside her chair. I know this isn't what we discussed, he said softly. If you'd rather not, why are you doing this? She interrupted, searching his face. You've already helped me escape my uncle. You don't need to bind yourself to me. A shadow crossed his features. Your uncle is a determined man. Without legal protection, he might find another way to cause trouble. This way, your property is secure until you come of age. But why you? You don't know me, Clayton hesitated. I know enough. I know you stood your ground in that saloon when most would have crumbled. I know you love your home enough to fight for it. And I know what it's like to lose everything you care about. Before Gwen could respond, the door opened, and Sheriff Riley returned with the Reverend, a kind-faced man with silver hair. Behind them came Widow Parker herself, along with the town's doctor, summoned as witnesses. Are you certain about this, my dear? Reverend Michaels asked Gwen gently. She looked at Clayton, this stranger who had stepped into her life like a guardian angel. There was kindness in his eyes, and something else, a sense of honor that reminded her of her father. This wasn't how she'd imagined her wedding day, but nothing in her life had gone as planned since her parents' deaths. I'm certain, she said, rising to her feet. The ceremony was brief. They exchanged vows in the sheriff's office with only their minimal audience as witnesses. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Clayton gently squeezed her hand but made no move to kiss her. I've arranged for rooms at my boarding house tonight, Widow Parker announced. It's too late to head out to the ranch, and you both look like you could use a good meal and rest. As they walked the short distance to the boarding house, Clayton offered Gwen his arm but maintained a respectful distance. The streets of Willow Springs were quiet now. most of the townsfolk having retired for the evening. "I want you to know," Clayton said as they approached the boarding house, "that I meant what I said. This is a marriage in name only. You'll have your own room tonight and always, if that's what you wish." Gwen nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Thank you for everything." Widow Parker showed them to adjacent rooms and then brought them a simple but hearty meal of beef stew and fresh bread. As they ate in the small sitting room, Gwen finally allowed herself to study her new husband more carefully. Clayton Dawson was handsome, with strong features and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. His hands were calloused from work, and though he carried a gun like most men in these parts, he didn't have the hard look of a gunslinger. "You should know something about me," he said, setting down his spoon. "I'm a rancher by trade. I have a small spread about 10 miles north of here, nothing like your family's ranch, but enough to get by. I came to town today to sell some horses." "So you're my neighbor in a way," Gwen observed. He nodded. "That's partly why I recognized your name in the saloon. Your father had a reputation as a fair man. People respected him." Tears pricked at Gwen's eyes. "He was the best man I've ever known." Clayton's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss, both your parents. Thank you." Gwen wiped away a tear. It happened so quickly. The fever came, and within a week they were both gone. Uncle Sela's arrived the day after we buried them. At first I was grateful not to be alone, but then— "He showed his true nature," Clayton finished for her. Gwen nodded. "He started selling off livestock, firing the ranch hands my father trusted. When I protested, he reminded me that as my guardian, he had the right to manage the estate. A week ago, he brought me to town, claiming we needed supplies. Tonight was the first I learned of his real plan." "The Double C is a valuable property," Clayton acknowledged. "Your father built something special there. You know the ranch. I delivered horses there once, about 2 years ago. Your father was impressed with my stock. He said I had a good eye for horseflesh." The connection, however slight, felt like a lifeline to Gwen, a small thread connecting her new present to her lost past. "What will we do tomorrow?" she asked, suddenly realizing how unprepared she was for what came next. "We'll head out to your ranch at first light," Clayton replied. "I'd like to see what condition it's in and make sure your uncle hasn't caused too much damage. After that, it's your home. You should decide how you want to proceed." "Our home, I suppose," Gwen said, testing the words. "At least for now." Clayton's eyes met hers. "I meant what I said to the judge. When you turn 21, if you want me to leave, I will, no questions asked." As they finished their meal and prepared to retire to their separate rooms, Gwen found herself wondering about the man she had just married. He was a stranger, and yet he had shown her more kindness in one evening than she had experienced in the 3 months since her parents' deaths. "Good night, Mr. Dawson," she said, pausing at her door. He smiled, a gentle curl of his lips that softened his serious face. "Under the circumstances, I think you might call me Clayton." "Good night, Clayton," she amended, "and thank you again." "Sleep well, Gwendolyn." "Gwen," she corrected. "My friends call me Gwen." His smile widened just a fraction. "Good night then, Gwen." As she closed the door behind her, Gwen leaned against it, overwhelmed by the day's events. Hours ago, she had been merchandised to be auctioned to the highest bidder. Now she was a wife, if only in name, and tomorrow she would return to the home she loved. For the first time in months, she slept without fear. Morning dawned with the promise of a scorching day. Gwen dressed in her one remaining decent dress, a blue calico that had once been her everyday wear, but now felt like finery after months of neglect. Widow Parker had helped her wash her face and arrange her hair, clucking sympathetically over her circumstances, but offering warm congratulations on her marriage. "Clayton Dawson is a good man," the widow had told her. "Quiet, keeps to himself mostly, but always ready to lend a hand when needed." "You could have done far worse, my dear." Gwen had merely nodded, Not knowing how to explain the strange arrangement of their marriage to the kind woman, Clayton was waiting for her in the dining room, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt. He stood when she entered, an instinctive gesture of respect that reminded Gwen of her father. "I've arranged for a wagon," he said after they'd breakfasted. "Sheriff Riley is holding your uncle at the jail until we're safely away. The judge wants to speak with him about misappropriation of your funds." Relief washed over Gwen. "Will he face charges?" "That depends on what the judge decides, but at minimum, he won't be allowed near you or your property again." The wagon was waiting outside the boarding house, loaded with supplies Clayton had purchased that morning: flour, coffee, sugar, and other staples. His own horse, a magnificent chestnut gelding, was tied to the back. "I hope you don't mind," he said, helping her onto the wagon seat. "I thought you might need provisions. Your uncle may have depleted the pantry." The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Gwen deeply. "Thank you. That's very considerate." As they pulled away from town, Gwen felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. The familiar landscape of rolling hills and distant mountains welcomed her like old friends. The Double C Ranch lay 8 miles east of Willow Springs, nestled in a fertile valley where her father had raised some of the finest cattle in the territory. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Clayton glanced at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Not much to tell. I call it the Broken D. Not very original, I know. I run about 100 head of cattle, but my real business is horses. I break and train them for ranchers and the occasional cavalry contract." "And your family?" she asked tentatively, his expression sobered. "I don't have family, not anymore. My father died in the war when I was a boy. My mother raised me alone until I was 16, then a winter fever took her." "I'm sorry," Gwen said softly, understanding his loss all too well. He nodded his acknowledgement. "I worked ranch jobs until I saved enough to buy my own place 3 years ago. It's small, but it's mine." "It sounds like you've built something to be proud of." A faint smile touched his lips. "I'm working on it." As they approached the long drive leading to the Double C, Gwen's heart began to race. She hadn't been sure she would ever see her home again. The whitewashed farmhouse came into view, its wide porch and sturdy columns exactly as she remembered. But as they drew closer, signs of neglect became apparent. The garden her mother had lovingly tended was overgrown with weeds. The barn doors hung askew on their hinges, and the corral fences needed mending. Clayton's experienced eyes took in the state of the property. "Nothing that can't be fixed," he said reassuringly. When they pulled up to the house, the front door opened, and an older man emerged, rifle in hand. His weathered face broke into a smile when he recognized Gwen. "Miss Gwendolyn, thank the Lord." He lowered his rifle and hurried down the steps. "We thought you might never return." "Walter," Gwen climbed down from the wagon and embraced the old ranch hand. "You're still here. I thought Uncle Silas dismissed everyone." "He tried," Walter huffed. "Told me and Martha to clear out, but your pa hired me 30 years ago, and I wasn't about to abandon his place on the say-so of that snake. We've been staying in the old bunkhouse, keeping an eye on things best we can." Tears of gratitude filled Gwen's eyes. Walter and his wife, Martha, had been fixtures at the Double C for as long as she could remember. Martha had been their cook, and Walter had served as foreman even as his joints had grown too stiff for the hardest ranch work. "I can't tell you what this means to me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Walter's gaze shifted to Clayton, who had come around the wagon. His expression grew wary. "And who might this be?" Before Gwen could answer, the door opened again, and Martha appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. Her cry of delight at seeing Gwen quickly transformed into curiosity about the stranger at her side. "This is Clayton Dawson," Gwen said, realizing she needed to explain the complicated situation. "My husband, Both Walter and Martha's eyes widened in shock. "Husband?" Martha echoed. "But Miss Gwen, you've only been gone a week." Clayton stepped forward, extending his hand to Walter. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir. I understand you've been looking after the ranch. You have my gratitude." Walter shook his hand cautiously, studying the younger man's face. "When did this wedding take place?" "Yesterday evening," Clayton answered honestly. "It's a long story, one I think we should discuss inside if you're willing to hear it." Martha's hospitable nature overrode her surprise. "Of course, come in. I'll put on some coffee. You both look like you could use it." Inside, the house was dusty but fundamentally unchanged. Gwen's heart ached at the sight of her mother's rocking chair by the fireplace, and her father's books still lined up on the shelves. It felt like stepping back in time, to before her world had shattered. Over coffee and Martha's freshly baked biscuits, Gwen and Clayton explained everything: Silas's betrayal, the auction, Clayton's intervention, and their marriage of convenience. Walter's face darkened with anger at Silas's actions, while Martha repeatedly pressed her hand to her heart in distress. "That miserable worm," Walter growled. "Your pa never did trust him, Miss Gwen. Said his brother had a weakness for cards and whiskey that would be his undoing." "He sold off most of the cattle," Martha added sadly, "and all but 4 of the horses. The hired hands left when he stopped paying wages, except for Walter and me. We couldn't leave, not when we knew you'd need someone here when you returned." Gwen reached across the table to squeeze Martha's weathered hand. "I don't know how I'll ever repay your loyalty." "Nonsense, child. Your parents were family to us." Walter turned his attention to Clayton. "So you married Miss Gwen to protect her from that snake Silas, expecting nothing in return?" Clayton met the older man's skeptical gaze steadily. "That's right. When she turns 21 and her inheritance is secure, she's free to make her own decisions about her future." Walter and Martha exchanged glances, a silent communication born of decades together. "Well," Walter said finally, "seems we owe you a debt of gratitude, Mr. Dawson. But I hope you understand if we keep a watchful eye. Miss Gwen is precious to us." "I'd expect nothing less," Clayton replied with a nod of respect. As Martha showed Gwen upstairs to freshen up, Walter took Clayton out to survey the property. The older man didn't mince words as he outlined the ranch's condition. Silas sold off about 3/4 of the herd, nearly 200 head of prime cattle, took the money, and disappeared to the saloons and gaming halls in larger towns. He was gone more than he was here, which was a blessing in disguise. Clayton nodded, taking in the empty corrals and fields that should have been dotted with cattle. "What about the hands? Will they come back if there's work and wages?" "Most would," Walter confirmed. "They were loyal to James Caldwell, but it'll take capital to restart operations at the scale they once were." "How much land does the ranch encompass?" 5,000 acres with water rights to Cottonwood Creek. Prime grazing land, some of the best in the territory. Clayton whistled softly. The Double C was far larger than his modest spread. No wonder Silas had been so eager to get his hands on it. "The immediate need is to secure what's left and start rebuilding," Clayton said thoughtfully. "I have some savings, and about 20 head of cattle I could bring over. It's not much compared to what was lost, but it's a start." Walter studied him with new respect. "You'd invest your own money and stock in Miss Gwen's ranch, in our ranch," Clayton corrected gently, "at least for the next 9 months. After that, whatever I've contributed stays with the property when I leave." The older man's eyebrows rose. "You truly intend to walk away when she turns 21, if that's what she wants," Clayton said simply. "I gave my word." Walter nodded slowly. "You're either the most honorable man I've met since James Caldwell or the biggest fool in the territory." Clayton smiled wryly. "Probably a bit of both." By the time they returned to the house, Martha had prepared a more substantial meal, and was showing Gwen the accounts she'd kept during Silas's mismanagement. The older woman had documented every animal sold and every supply purchased, creating a record of Silas's theft. "This will help the judge's case against him," Gwen said, gratitude in her voice. "Martha, you're a wonder." Dinner that evening was a strange affair, the start of a new chapter for all of them. As they ate, they discussed plans for rebuilding the ranch. Clayton suggested they focus first on repairing the most essential structures and then work on rebuilding the herd gradually. "I can bring my cattle over tomorrow," he offered. "And I have 2 mares in foal that would do well here. The grazing is better than on my land. What about your own ranch?" Gwen asked. "You can't just abandon it." Clayton considered this. "I'll need to check on it regularly, but for now, focusing our efforts here makes more sense. The Double C has better facilities and water access. Once things are stable, we can decide how to manage both properties." After dinner, Martha insisted on preparing the master bedroom for the newlyweds, despite Gwen's awkward attempts to explain their arrangement. Clayton smoothly intervened. "I'll take the spare room, Mrs. Hoffman," he said. "Gwen should have her parents' room." Martha looked scandalized. "But your husband and wife," Gwen blushed deeply, unable to find the right words to explain. "We're taking things slowly," Clayton said diplomatically. "It's been a difficult time for Gwen, losing her parents and then dealing with her uncle's betrayal. We both agree there's no rush to." Certain aspects of marriage. Though clearly confused, Martha nodded. "As you wish. I'll make up the blue room for you, Mr. Dawson." Later, as Gwen prepared for bed in her parents' room, surrounded by their belongings and memories, a soft knock came at her door. "Gwen." "May I speak with you for a moment?" Clayton's voice was low, mindful of the others in the house. She opened the door, already dressed in her nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Clayton stood respectfully in the hallway, making no move to enter. "I wanted to make sure you're comfortable with the plans we discussed at dinner," he said. "This is your home, and while I'm eager to help, I don't want to overstep." The consideration in his words touched her. "I'm grateful for your help, Clayton." "I wouldn't know where to begin restoring the ranch on my own," he nodded. "We'll take it one day at a time. And Gwen," I meant what I said to Walter. "Whatever I contribute, cattle, horses, my labor, it all stays with the Double C, regardless of what happens when you turn 21. "That's very generous," she said softly, studying his face in the dim light of the hallway. "But what about your own ranch?" A faint smile touched his lips. "Let's just say I've always believed that helping others eventually comes back to you in unexpected ways." As she closed the door after bidding him good night, Gwen found herself wondering about the complex man she had married. Clayton Dawson was unlike anyone she'd ever met, principled, kind, and seemingly without ulterior motives. She wasn't naive enough to believe that such men were common, especially not in this harsh territory where survival often depended on putting oneself first. Yet here he was, offering to rebuild her family's legacy while expecting nothing in return. It was almost too good to be true. But the alternative, believing he had some hidden agenda, seemed equally implausible given his actions thus far. With these thoughts swirling in her mind, Gwen climbed into her parents' bed, breathing in the faint remnants of her mother's lavender sachet. Despite the tumult of the past days, sleep came quickly, dreamless and deep. The following weeks established a new rhythm at the Double C. True to his word, Clayton brought his cattle and pregnant mares to join the ranch's diminished stock. He worked from dawn until dusk alongside Walter, mending fences, repairing buildings, and tending to the animals. Gwen threw herself into restoring the house and gardens, working with Martha to bring order back to the domestic side of ranch life. Her mother had taught her well, and though the work was hard, it was also healing. Each repaired window frame and freshly weeded garden bed felt like reclaiming a piece of her parents' legacy. 3 of the former ranch hands returned when word spread that Gwen was back and the ranch was operating again. With their help, Clayton was able to undertake more ambitious repairs to the barn and corrals. On Sundays, they all rode into town for church services. The first Sunday had been uncomfortable, with townsfolk openly staring and whispering about Gwen's sudden marriage. But Clayton had remained steadfastly at her side, his quiet dignity and evident respect for her silencing the most vicious gossips. Judge Wilson had formalized charges against Silas for embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty, aided by Martha's meticulous records. He'd been transported to the county seat to await trial, effectively removing him as a threat to Gwen's inheritance. As April turned to May, the ranch began to flourish again. Spring rains brought new growth to the pastures, and the first of Clayton's mares delivered a healthy foal, which he insisted belonged to the double Seaticus breeding stock. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Gwen found herself studying Clayton's profile. He was whittling a small piece of wood, his hands moving with practiced precision. In the month since their unconventional wedding, she had come to know many things about him: that he preferred coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, that he had a gift for calming frightened horses, that he rayed voraciously when time allowed. Yet in other ways, he remained a mystery. He rarely spoke of his past beyond the basic facts he'd already shared, and though unfailingly kind and respectful, he maintained a certain reserve that she hadn't been able to penetrate. "What are you making?" she asked, nodding toward the wood in his hands. He held it up, the emerging shape of a small horse. "Just passing time. My mother taught me. She said idle hands led to idle thoughts, and idle thoughts were the devil's playground." "She sounds wise," Gwen said, smiling. She was. A shadow crossed his face. She deserved better than the life she got. Something in his tone made Gwen bold enough to ask, "What happened to her? You mentioned she was sold by her brother." Clayton's hand stilled. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then he sighed. "My mother was the daughter of a successful merchant in St. Louis. When her parents died of cholera, her brother took control of the family business and her inheritance. He gambled away most of it, then arranged her marriage to settle his debts." The parallels to Gwen's own story were unmistakable. "Your father was the man who bought her?" "No," Clayton said, his voice hardening. "My father was a freight driver who saw what was happening and tried to help her escape. They fell in love, married properly, and fled west. Her brother sent men after them. There was a confrontation, and my father was injured, never fully recovered. When the war came, he enlisted despite his health. Died at Gettysburg." "I'm so sorry," Gwen whispered. "My mother rebuilt her life twice, once after her brother's betrayal and again after my father's death. She taught me that true strength isn't about physical power or wealth, but about facing each day with dignity and kindness, no matter what life throws at you." Gwen felt tears pricking her eyes. "She would be proud of the man you've become." Clayton's gaze met hers, intense and searching. "I hope so." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Then he looked away, returning to his carving. "Clayton," Gwen said softly, "I need to ask you something." He looked up, waiting. "Why did you really help me that night, the whole truth?" His hand stilled again. "I told you about my mother, yes, but there must be many women in difficult circumstances. You can't save them all." "Why me?" Clayton was silent for so long that Gwen thought he might not answer. Finally, he set aside his carving. "I knew your father," he admitted. "Not well, but enough to respect him. When I delivered those horses 2 years ago, he invited me to stay for dinner. We talked about ranching horses, and my dream of building something meaningful. He gave me advice that helped me through some tough times." Surprise washed over Gwen. "You never mentioned that." "I didn't want you to think I was trying to use a connection to your father to gain your trust." Clayton's eyes held hers. When I walked into that saloon and heard Sela's auctioning off James Caldwell's daughter, I couldn't walk away. Not just because of my mother's experience, but because your father had shown me kindness when I was struggling. I owed him that much. Gwen absorbed this new information, feeling a fresh connection to Clayton through her father's memory. "Thank you for telling me," she said finally. "It means a great deal to know you respected him." Clayton nodded, then surprised her by reaching into his pocket and pulling out something small. "I've been waiting for the right moment to give you this," he said, extending his hand. In his palm lay a simple gold band, a wedding ring. "I bought it in town last week," he explained. "I know our marriage is unconventional, but I thought you should have a proper ring if you want it, for appearances if nothing else." Gwen stared at the ring, emotions swirling within her. It was a practical gesture, meant to reinforce the legitimacy of their arrangement in the eyes of others. Yet there was something undeniably intimate about it. "You don't have to wear it," he added quickly, misinterpreting her hesitation. "I just thought it's beautiful," she interrupted, extending her left hand. "Would you?" Their eyes locked as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if made for her. "Thank you," she whispered. His fingers lingered against hers for a moment before he withdrew his hand. "I should check on that new foal before turning in," he said, rising to his feet. As he walked toward the barn, Gwen remained on the porch, the weight of the gold band unfamiliar but not unwelcome on her finger. Their arrangement might be temporary, a means to secure her inheritance, but something deeper was taking root between them, something neither had anticipated. The following Sunday, as they rode back from church, Clayton suggested they take a detour to show Gwen his property. The Broken D Ranch lay northwest of the Double C, in rockier terrain less suited to cattle but ideal for horses. As they crested a hill, the small ranch came into view, a modest house, a well-built barn, and several corrals containing a dozen or so horses. "It's not much compared to the Double C," Clayton said as they approached, "but it's paid for." "It's wonderful," Gwen replied honestly. The buildings were simple but solid, and she could see Clayton's careful hand in every detail. "You built it yourself?" He nodded, pride evident in his expression. "Every board. Took me 3 years of saving and working other ranches before I could buy the land. Another year to build the house and barn." Inside, the house was sparsely furnished but meticulously maintained. A bookshelf filled with well-worn volumes dominated one wall, and a stone fireplace anchored the main room. It was the home of a man who valued function over ornament, but small touches, a hand-carved chess set on a table, a colorful quilt on the bed hinted at deeper layers to his character. "Do you miss it?" Gwen asked as they stood in the main room. "Being here," Clayton considered the question. "Sometimes it's quiet here, peaceful." He glanced at her. "But the Double C has its own appeal." The way he looked at her made Gwen wonder if he meant the ranch itself or her company. Before she could pursue the thought, he suggested they continue their ride, showing her the spring that provided water for his property and the stand of pines, where he harvested wood for building projects. As they rode back toward the Double C, Gwen found herself thinking about the contrast between their properties. The Double C was larger, more established, with rich grasslands and abundant water. The Broken D was smaller, its terrain more challenging, but carefully adapted to maximize its potential. "Clayton," she said as they neared home, "I've been thinking about our situation." He glanced at her, his expression carefully neutral. "Oh, you've put so much work into the Double C these past weeks. Your own ranch must be suffering from neglect." "I ride over twice a week to check on things. The horses are hardy, and I've arranged with a neighbor to keep an eye out." "Still," Gwen persisted, "it seems unfair that you're devoting all your energy to my property while yours sits idle." Clayton reined his horse to a stop, and Gwen followed suit. "What are you suggesting?" "Perhaps we could find a way to operate both ranches," she said. The Double C has the cattle operation and the Broken D could focus on horses. Together, they could complement each other. His eyes studied her face intently. Together. Gwen felt heat rise to her cheeks as she realized the implication of her words. I mean, until I turned 21, of course, as part of our arrangement. Of course, he echoed, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he added, it's a sound business proposition. We could certainly discuss it. As they continued riding, Gwen couldn't help feeling that something had shifted between them, a door opened to possibilities neither had acknowledged before. The summer brought scorching heat and relentless work as they implemented their plan to run both ranches in tandem. Clayton moved his remaining horses to the Broken D, focusing that property on breeding and training, while the Double C concentrated on rebuilding its cattle herd. 3 more of the original ranch hands returned, along with their families, bringing life back to the bunkhouses and cookhouse. Gwen found herself riding to the Broken D at least once a week, ostensibly to coordinate operations, but increasingly because she enjoyed the time alone with Clayton. Away from the watchful eyes of Martha and Walter, they could talk more freely, sharing stories and dreams as they worked side by side. One blazing July afternoon, they sought refuge from the heat in the shade of the pines near the Broken Deticus spring. Clayton had brought a book of poetry, Tennyson's Idylls of the King, and read aloud while Gwen worked on mending a shirt. The domesticity of the moment struck her suddenly, how comfortable they had become in each other's company. Clayton, she said when he paused in his reading, may I ask you something personal? He marked his place in the book. Of course. In all the time we've known each other, you've never spoken of any attachments before me. Was there ever someone special? The question had been on her mind for some time. Clayton was handsome, kind, and capable qualities any woman would value. Yet at 25 he had been unmarried until their arrangement. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. There was someone once. Sarah was her name. We were young, I was 19, she was 18. Her father owned a ranch where I worked after my mother died. Gwen waited, sensing there was more to the story. We planned to marry when I'd saved enough for a small place of our own, he continued. But a wealthier man came along, a cattle buyer from Kansas City, twice my age but with money and connections her father couldn't resist. She married him instead, Gwen guessed softly. Clayton nodded. Her father made the decision and she accepted it, said it was for the best, that dreams don't feed a family or provide security. I'm sorry, Gwen said, understanding now the pain that occasionally shadowed his eyes. That must have hurt terribly. It did at the time, but looking back I see that Sarah was practical in a way I wasn't. She chose security over uncertainty. His eyes found Gwen's. I can't blame her for that choice, even if it broke my heart. Is that why you never married? Because you were afraid of being hurt again. A faint smile touched his lips. No, I never married because I decided I wouldn't settle for less than a true partnership, someone who shared not just my bed but my dreams, my struggles, my life. Someone who would stand beside me through whatever came. Not because it was practical, but because we were stronger together than apart. His words resonated deep within Gwen. Wasn't that exactly what they had been building these past months? A partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose. And now, she asked, her heart beating faster. You're married, even if it's not conventional. Clayton's gaze intensified. Now I find myself in an unexpected situation. Married to a woman I admire more each day, but bound by a promise that our arrangement is temporary. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Gwen found herself unable to look away from his face, so earnest and open in this private moment. Promises can change, she said softly, if both parties wish it. Clayton moved closer, his hand coming to rest beside hers on the blanket they sat upon. Gwen, he began, his voice low and serious. "I need to be clear. I didn't help you that night in the saloon with any expectation of I know," she interrupted. "That's why I—" She trailed off, uncertain how to express the feelings that had been growing inside her. "Why you what?" he prompted gently. Before she could answer, the distant sound of hoofbeats interrupted the moment. Clayton was on his feet in an instant, hand moving instinctively to the gun at his hip. Moments later, Walter appeared, riding hard. "Mr. Dawson, Miss Gwen," he called, reining his horse to a stop. "Thank the Lord I found you. There's trouble at the Double C." Clayton was already gathering their things. "What kind of trouble?" Walter's face was grim. "Sela's escaped custody. He showed up at the ranch with 3 rough-looking men demanding to see you both. When Martha told them you were over here, they started tearing through the house, looking for the deed and valuables." Fear gripped Gwen's heart. "Is Martha all right?" "She's fine. Managed to slip out the back and warn the hands. They're holding the house, but Sela's was threatening to burn it down if you don't show up with the deed." Clayton's expression hardened. "We need to get back immediately." He turned to Gwen, his voice softening. "You should stay here while Walter and I know," Gwen interrupted firmly. "This is my home, my fight. I'm coming with you." Pride flashed in Clayton's eyes, quickly replaced by concern. "It's dangerous." "All the more reason we face it together," she replied, already mounting her horse. "As partners." The ride back to the Double C was tense, with Clayton explaining his strategy to Walter as they galloped. They would approach from the west, using the creek bed for cover, then assess the situation before making their move. As they neared the ranch, they slowed, dismounting to continue on foot. From their vantage point behind the barn, they could see Sela's and his men in front of the main house. 2 of the ranch hands stood on the porch, rifles ready, while the others were positioned strategically around the property. "There's your precious niece now," one of Sela's men shouted, spotting them. Sela's turned, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Gwendolyn, come out here with that deed, girl, or I'll burn this place to the ground." Clayton put a protective arm in front of Gwen, but she stepped forward, her chin high. "You have no right to be here, Uncle," she called back. "The judge ruled that you violated your guardianship. You stole from me and tried to sell me like cattle." Sela sneered. "Such dramatic accusations from an ungrateful child. I was arranging a proper marriage for you, a financial necessity, after your father's mismanagement left the ranch in debt." "That's a lie," Gwen replied evenly. "The Double C was prosperous, and you know it. That's why you wanted to sell it for your own gain." "Enough talk," Sela snarled, pulling a pistol from his belt. "Give me the deed and all the gold your mother hoarded, or I start shooting your loyal servants one by one." Clayton moved to stand beside Gwen, his own gun drawn but pointed at the ground. "Mr. Caldwell, you're outnumbered and in violation of a court order. Surrender now, and perhaps the judge will show leniency." Sela laughed bitterly. "Who are you to lecture me, Cowboy?" "The opportunist who stole my niece to get his hands on her property. Don't think I haven't figured out your game. My husband has more honor in his little finger than you have in your entire body," Gwen said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Now take your men and leave or face the consequences." For a tense moment, it seemed Sela might back down. Then one of his men raised his rifle, aiming at Clayton. "Enough of this," the man growled. "Let's just take what we came for." What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion and sound. Clayton shoved Gwen behind him as shots rang out. The ranch hands returned fire from their positions. Sela and his men scattered, diving for cover. One of them fell, clutching his shoulder, while another fired wildly toward the barn. Clayton pushed Gwen toward the relative safety of the bunkhouse. "Stay down," he ordered, returning fire with measured precision. But Gwen couldn't just hide while others defended her home. Crawling to the edge of the bunkhouse, she peered around the corner and saw Sela breaking away from the gunfight, heading toward the main house's side entrance. He meant to get inside, to search for the deed and valuables while everyone was distracted. Without hesitation, Gwen slipped around the back of the bunkhouse and ran toward the house, using the smokehouse and chicken coops for cover. She reached the kitchen door just as Silas was trying the front, finding it barricaded by the ranch hands. Inside, the house was eerily quiet compared to the chaos outside. Gwen moved quickly to her father's study, where she kept a small derringer in the desk drawer, a gift from her father who had insisted she learn to protect herself in a territory where law was often distant. The front door splintered as Silas finally broke through. Gwen positioned herself behind the study door, the derringer steady in her hand despite her fear. She heard him ransacking the parlor, cursing as he found nothing of value. "Where is it?" he muttered, moving toward the study. "That deed has to be here somewhere." As he entered, Gwen stepped out from behind the door, the derringer aimed at his chest. "Looking for this, uncle?" she asked coldly, nodding toward the safe in the corner where she knew he'd focus his search. Silas whirled around, his eyes widening in surprise before narrowing with calculation. "Gwendolyn, always the dutiful daughter, your father would be so disappointed to see you pointing a gun at your own flesh and blood." "My father would be proud that I'm defending what he built," she countered. "Now drop your pistol." Instead, Silas took a step toward her, his expression changing to one of false concern. "You won't shoot me, girl. You don't have it in you. You're soft like your mother." "My mother was the strongest person I've ever known," Gwen replied, her fingers steady on the trigger. "And she taught me to recognize a snake when I see one. Drop the gun, or I'll shoot." Silas hesitated, weighing his options. Outside, the gunfire had diminished, suggesting the fight was ending. He must have known he was running out of time. With a sudden movement, he raised his pistol. "You first, niece." A shot rang out, but not from Gwen's derringer or Silas's pistol. Clayton stood in the doorway, his smoking gun trained on Silas, who now clutched his arm in pain, his own weapon clattering to the floor. "It's over, Caldwell," Clayton said, kicking the fallen pistol away. "Your men are either dead or captured. The sheriff is on his way." Silas sank to his knees, his face ashen with pain and defeat. "You've ruined everything," he hissed at Gwen. "Your father's empire should have been mine. I was the firstborn. I deserved it." "My father built the Double C through hard work and integrity," Gwen replied, lowering her derringer now that the immediate danger had passed. "You could have built something of your own instead of trying to steal what wasn't yours." As Walter and two ranch hands entered to secure Silas, Clayton crossed to Gwen, his eyes searching her face. "Are you all right? I nearly stopped breathing when I realized you'd gone after him alone." The concern in his voice wrapped around her like an embrace. "I'm fine. I couldn't let him destroy my home, our home." Clayton's expression softened at her words. Impulsively, Gwen stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, burying her face against his chest. After a brief moment of surprise, his arms encircled her, holding her close as the tension of the confrontation finally released in silent tears. "It's over now," he murmured into her hair. "You're safe. The ranch is safe." But as Silas was led away, cursing his fate, Gwen knew that something fundamental had changed. In facing down her uncle, in defending her home alongside Clayton and the loyal ranch hands, she had claimed her place not just as James Caldwell's daughter, but as the true mistress of the Double C. And in those moments of danger, one truth had crystallized in her heart. Her marriage of convenience had become anything but convenient. She had fallen in love with Clayton Dawson. The aftermath of Silas's attack brought unexpected clarity to the Double C. Sheriff Riley arrived with deputies to take Silas and his surviving men into custody, assuring Gwen that her uncle would face serious charges that would keep him imprisoned for years to come. The physical damage to the ranch was minimal: a few broken windows, splintered doors, and bullet holes in the barn siding. But the emotional impact ran deeper. For Gwen, confronting Silas had been the final step in reclaiming her parents' legacy. She was no longer the grieving daughter or the helpless niece, but a woman defending what was rightfully hers. That evening, after the sheriff had gone and the injured had been tended to, Gwen found Clayton on the porch. He stood looking out at the darkening landscape, his profile illuminated by the golden light spilling from the windows. "Martha says supper will be ready soon," she said, joining him at the railing. He nodded, turning to face her. "How are you feeling?" Truly, Gwen considered the question. "Strangely at peace. For the first time since my parents died, I feel like I'm standing on solid ground again." She paused, gathering her courage. "Clayton, about what I said earlier at the spring before Walter interrupted us." His eyes held hers intently. "Yes, I meant it. About promises changing if both parties wish it." Her heart pounded as she continued. "These past months with you have been unexpected. When you stepped into that saloon, I thought you were saving me from my uncle. But now I realize you were giving me the chance to save myself, to become the person my parents raised me to be." Clayton took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "And who is that person, Gwen?" "Someone who knows her own mind," she said softly. "Someone who recognizes a true partnership when she finds it and isn't afraid to acknowledge what's in her heart." His hand moved to cover hers on the railing, his touch gentle but certain. "And what is in your heart?" Gwen took a deep breath. "You are. I know our arrangement was meant to be temporary, a protection until I turned 21, but I don't want it to end." She met his gaze squarely. "I love you, Clayton, not out of gratitude or necessity, but because of who you are, your kindness, your integrity, your strength." For a long moment, Clayton was silent, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, transforming his serious features with a joy that took her breath away. "Gwen," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I've been falling in love with you since the moment you stood up to your uncle in that saloon. Every day since has only deepened those feelings." His free hand came up to cup her cheek. "I never dared hope you might feel the same way." "How could I not?" she whispered. "You've shown me what true partnership looks like, not just in words but in actions, every day in 100 small ways." Clayton's thumb gently stroked her cheek. "I need you to be certain. I don't want you to feel obligated because of what I've done for the ranch or—" Gwen silenced him by rising on her tiptoes and pressing her lips to his. After a moment of surprise, Clayton responded, his arms encircling her waist as he returned her kiss with restrained passion. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Clayton rested his forehead against hers. "I love you, Gwendolyn Dawson, not for your land or your dowry, but for your courage, your kindness, and your remarkable heart." She smiled, joy bubbling up inside her. "And I love you, Clayton Dawson. Not because you saved me, but because you truly saw me when no one else did." Their second kiss was deeper, a promise of the life they would build together. No longer a marriage of convenience, but a union of choice, of love, of true partnership. The months that followed transformed the Double C and Broken D from separate entities into a unified operation that combined the strengths of both properties. Clayton moved his remaining belongings from the Broken D house to the Double C, though they maintained both properties, using the smaller ranch primarily for horse breeding and training. Gwen's 21st birthday in October passed without the dissolution of their marriage that had been originally planned. Instead, they celebrated with a proper wedding reception at the ranch, inviting neighbors and friends to witness their formal commitment to each other. Judge Wilson attended, presenting them with updated marriage documents that removed all the temporary provisions from their original arrangement. "Though it seems you two figured things out just fine on your own," he observed with a twinkle in his eye, "by Christmas, The Double C was thriving again. The cattle herd was growing, and Clayton's horses were gaining a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as Denver. Martha and Walter continued to run the household and ranch operations respectively, though Gwen and Clayton were increasingly involved in all aspects of both properties. On Christmas Eve, as they sat before the fire after everyone else had retired, Clayton presented Gwen with a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with a red ribbon. "What's this?" she asked, surprised. "Open it and see," he replied with a smile. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its cover embossed with the intertwined letters D and C. "I thought you might want to record our story," Clayton explained, "for our children someday, how their parents found each other in the most unexpected way." Tears welled in Gwen's eyes. "Children." Clayton nodded, taking her hand in his. "If you want them. I know we haven't talked about it much, but I've been thinking about our future, a family, expanding the ranch, maybe building a bigger house at the Broken D someday for when our children are grown and want their own place." "You've thought about all of that?" Gwen asked, touched by how deeply he had considered their future together. "Every day," he admitted. "Ever since you told me you loved me, I've been planning our future in my head, but I wanted to wait until you were ready to discuss it." Gwen set the journal aside and moved into his arms. "I'm ready now," she whispered against his lips. "For everything, children, a bigger house, whatever comes our way, as long as we face it together." "Together," he agreed, sealing their promise with a kiss. As the fire crackled and snow began to fall outside, Gwen marveled at the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the brink of being auctioned to the highest bidder to finding a love deeper and truer than she had ever imagined possible. Clayton had declared on that fateful night in the saloon that she was dowry enough. But the truth was, they had both received so much more than they had ever expected, a partnership built on respect, a love forged in adversity, and a future bright with promise. 10 years later, the Double C Broken D Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in the territory. Their cattle and horses were sought after throughout the West, and the ranch had expanded to nearly twice its original size through careful acquisitions of neighboring properties. Clayton and Gwen stood on the porch of their home, watching their 3 children play in the yard: 8-year-old James, 6-year-old Alina, and 3-year-old Thomas. The boys had Clayton's dark hair and steady temperament, while Alina was the image of her mother, with golden curls and a determined spirit. "Papa, look what I found," James called, running toward them with something cupped in his hands. He opened them carefully to reveal a small turtle, its shell gleaming in the sunlight. Clayton knelt to examine the creature. "That's a box turtle, son. Good find. Where did you spot him?" "By the creek, where you showed me last time," James replied proudly. Gwen smiled at the exchange, her heart full. Clayton was the father she had hoped he would be: patient, kind, and dedicated to teaching their children about the land they would someday inherit. Alina approached with Thomas toddling behind her, her self-appointed role as big sister taken very seriously. "Mama, can we have our picnic now? Thomas is getting hungry." "Of course, sweetheart," Gwen replied. "The basket is all packed. Papa will carry it down to the creek for us." As Clayton went inside to retrieve the picnic basket, Gwen gazed at the thriving ranch around her. The original buildings had been maintained and expanded, with new corrals and a larger barn added to accommodate their growing operations. Walter and Martha still lived in a comfortable cabin near the main house, though they had retired from daily ranch work, serving now as beloved grandparent figures to the children. Clayton returned with the basket, and their well-worn copy of Idols of the King, a tradition on their family picnics, was for him to read aloud while the children played. As they walked toward the creek, Clayton's free arm around her waist, Gwen reflected on how far they had come from that desperate night in the Golden Spur Saloon. Her uncle had eventually died in prison, bitter and unrepentant to the end. The last of her parents' jewelry had been fashioned into lockets for Alina and any future daughters, while their sons would someday inherit the pocket watches that had belonged to their grandfather. But the true inheritance, Gwen knew, was not in the physical possessions but in the values they passed on: honor, integrity, compassion, and the understanding that love was the greatest treasure of all. At the creek, they spread blankets in the shade of a cottonwood tree. The children immediately began exploring with strict instructions to stay within sight. Clayton settled against the tree trunk, drawing Gwen down beside him. "Happy?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Completely," she replied, resting her head on his shoulder. "You know, sometimes I still think about how differently things might have turned out if you hadn't walked into that saloon that night." Clayton's arm tightened around her. "I believe we would have found each other somehow. Some things are meant to be." Gwen smiled, thinking of the journal he had given her that first Christmas, now filled with 10 years of memories: their wedding reception, the births of their children, the growth of their ranch, and countless smaller moments of daily joy and occasional struggle. "I think you're right," she said. "But I'm grateful it happened the way it did. When you told those men I was dowry enough, I thought you were just being noble," Clayton chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I meant every word. But the truth is, Gwen, you've given me far more than I ever could have imagined: a family, a purpose, a love that grows stronger every day." As their children's laughter rang out across the creek and the sun warmed their faces, Gwen knew that the true wealth of their lives couldn't be measured in acres or cattle or gold, but in the love they had built together, a treasure far more precious than any dowry could ever be.